Canadians are in serious economic trouble, and the inconvenient reality is that things are going to have to get worse before they can get any better. Canada's households are drowning in a toxic brew of rising expenses and weakening economic conditions. For decades, Canada has papered over its stagnating economy with debt, government debt, corporate debt, and most of all, household debt. But now inflation is causing the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates, and that debt is becoming harder and harder to carry. The illusion of wealth that this debt created is beginning to crumble. The biggest problem right now is mortgage debt. Over the years, as house prices grew, Canadians took on larger and larger mortgages, and now many of those mortgages are simply unaffordable. New data from Canada's Big Six banks show that 1 in 5 Canadian mortgages are experiencing negative amortization. This means that the interest costs on those mortgages are so high that the monthly payment borrowers make don't even cover the interest. So every month, the bank rolls over some of that interest to future payments. This is happening with 22% of the mortgages at the Bank of Montreal. It's happening with 19% of mortgages at CIBC and 18% of mortgages at Toronto Dominion Bank, which means that the total amount owed on the mortgage grows every month. Instead of paying down their mortgage, these households are seeing their mortgages grow larger every month. Every month, they owe more and more money on their home, even as the value of those houses is falling. This is a clever but dangerous way of covering up the fact that many mortgage borrowers in Canada are effectively in default. The banks don't want their data to show that Canadians are defaulting on their debt because that would be bad for their stock price. It would shake people's confidence in Canada's banking system if it turned out the banks had loaned money irresponsibly. So instead, they're essentially acting as loan sharks, growing home buyers' debt burden month by month. In America during the housing crisis, this kind of behavior by banks was called predatory lending. But in Canada today, it's everywhere and no one is making a fuss about it. That's because no one wants to face the reality that Canadian households can no longer afford their mortgages. But this predatory lending can only go on for so long because banks can't allow the mortgages on their books to be larger than the value of the homes behind those mortgages. If that happens, then it's the banks themselves that are in financial trouble. And right now, house prices in Canada are falling fast. Since the peak of the housing market in February of 2022, the average house price in Canada has fallen by 18%. That's despite a brief rebound this spring when the Bank of Canada stopped raising rates and many homebuyers jumped into the market, believing that interest rates would soon be coming down. But that didn't happen. This summer, the Bank of Canada resumed its rate hikes, and now over-leveraged homeowners are beginning to panic. That's especially true for investor owners, those who bought properties on the expectation that house prices would keep going up forever. But that expectation was always foolish. Canada has seen house prices double in about a decade, while household income stayed roughly the same. There's only one way that this is possible, through larger and larger debt. So if you believe house prices will always go up, what you actually believe is that people will always take more and more debt. That is a truly dangerous idea to stake your wealth on, and yet that is what Canada has done. Now, the endgame is in sight. A recent report from CIBC estimated that half of the recently purchased investment properties in Toronto have negative cash flow. This means that the landlords who own the properties can't cover their mortgage with the rent they're getting on those properties. For a lot of them, that was okay until now, because they expected the value of their property to keep going up indefinitely. They would simply sell for way more money than they bought for. But now, with house prices down 18% in a year and a half, that logic has collapsed. Many can no longer afford to subsidize their tenants, so they have to make a decision: raise rents through the roof or put their properties on sale. Some are raising rents, which explains why rents have soared across Canada in the past few years. That's creating a massive spike in homelessness, which you can learn more about in our recent video on Canada's homelessness problem. But others are putting their properties up for sale. Right now, we're seeing a massive spike in new listings in the Greater Toronto area. The market is about to be flooded with new supply, and that supply isn't going to sell quickly. These homes are being sold with tenants in place, tenants who don't pay enough to cover the rent on the property. Who wants to buy a house like that? These investor owners will have to drop their prices sharply if they want to sell. They're in for massive losses, and when prices fall further, even more investors will be pushed into selling their properties. And so again, there will be more supply and even more price cuts, and so on and so forth. How bad can it get? Consider this. Canadians today have taken on way more mortgage debt than what Americans had when the US housing bubble collapsed 15 years ago. As a percentage of disposable income, Canadian household debt today is 30% higher than US household debt was at the peak of the housing bubble. If all that excess debt is unwound, unwound, we can expect Canada's housing crash to be considerably worse than the one the US experienced 15 years ago. For now, it's the investors who are in trouble. The owner-occupiers are being bailed out by the banks through negative amortization, but that will come to an end if anything goes wrong in Canada's economy and unemployment starts going up. When people lose their jobs, that's when they can't afford their mortgages, and that's when they're forced to sell their homes. And guess what? Canada's economy is now on the verge of recession, having shrunk in the third quarter of 2023 at an annual pace of 0.2%. But that doesn't take into account Canada's rapid population growth, thanks to the federal government's increasingly high immigration targets. Canada's population has grown by 1.7% over the last year, so adjusted on a per capita basis, Canada's economy is now shrinking at an annual rate of nearly 2%. That is a very unhealthy economy, and it's one that can't support the debt levels that Canadian households have taken on. Since the beginning of the new year, Canada's unemployment rate has risen from 5% to 5.5%, and a new report from economists at RBC expects the jobless rate to rise to 6.5% next year. Simply put, fewer and fewer people will be able to afford their high levels of mortgage debt. In Ontario, the economic engine of Canada, the jobless rate is expected to spike from 5.7% to 6.9%. And in British Columbia, the country's priciest housing market, it's expected to go from 5.4% to 5.7%. But that's actually an optimistic forecast, one that doesn't expect there to be a recession in Canada. So why is RBC predicting more unemployment even without a recession? Because Canada's population growth is running faster than the country's ability to create jobs. In August of this year, Canada added 40,000 new jobs, but population growth in that month was around 100,000, and of those, about 83,000 were working-age people above the age of 15. So if job growth were to keep up with population growth, Canada would need to create around 80,000 jobs per month, nearly twice as many as it created in August. And for all of this year, Canada has been averaging just 25,000 new jobs per month, less a third as many as it would need to keep up with population growth. As long as the population keeps growing faster than jobs, the unemployment rate will keep rising. The argument that all these immigrants will create the demand needed to prop up Canadian house prices is just plain wrong. It falls apart if all those immigrants are unemployed. And they are. Just look at the long lineup seen across Canada where migrants are waiting for hours for a shot at a low-wage job. For every one of these jobs, there are hundreds of people waiting in line. How are these people supposed to support Canada's housing market? The illusion that Canada's housing boom will save the country's economy is crumbling before our eyes. And if that wasn't enough, Canadians are now going to be facing rising taxes. This year, Canadian households and businesses are being hit with 5 new federal tax hikes, courtesy of the Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau. Businesses are facing higher payroll taxes that will amount to an extra $5,000 per employee on average. Drivers are being hit with a hike to the federal carbon tax, which adds an extra 14 cents per liter at the gas pump. Even with the carbon tax rebate checks the government is sending out, Canadians will still be paying between $400 and $850 more in gas costs per year after the latest increase. And the carbon tax is scheduled to go up way more in the coming years. Mandatory contributions to the Canada Pension Plan are going up, and so are the mandatory contributions to the Employment Insurance Program. And then there's the alcohol escalator tax that will add 6.3% to the cost of booze. Trudeau's government is facing a coming debt crisis, and his ministers know it. The government massively overspent during the pandemic when interest rates were low, and now that interest rates are rising, that debt is threatening the government's finances, just like mortgage debt is threatening Canadian households. And that's just federal taxes. This year, and over the next few years, many Canadians can expect to see serious increases in municipal taxes. Canadian cities have become addicted to the revenue generated by new housing development, and now developers are pulling back on new home construction. Municipal tax revenue is drying up. Cities across the country are facing massive budget holes, and their solution is simple: raise taxes. The city of Toronto just raised taxes on sales of high-end houses, and they've gone to the provincial government to ask for permission to create a municipal sales tax. In Vancouver, if current spending doesn't change, the city administration says property taxes will have to rise by 9% each year for the next 5 years. That means residents of Vancouver could see a cumulative total increase in their property tax bill of 54% over 5 years. The average property tax in Vancouver today is $3,000. 5 years from now, it could be above $4,500. But maybe no city is facing a tax hike as large as the Toronto suburb of Markham. City management recently unveiled a plan to raise property taxes by 6.4% this year and 93.3% over the 2 years after that. That's a total of 97.7% over 3 years. Markham residents are about to see their property taxes double. Today, Justin Trudeau is traveling the country trying to convince ordinary Canadians he's got their backs, but his message is completely confused. On the one hand, he's lowering taxes. He recently declared he'll be repealing the goods and service tax on new construction of rental apartments. On the other hand, he's also threatening to raise taxes on grocery stores. The Prime Minister has ordered Canada's largest grocery sellers, Loblaws, Sobeys, Empire, Walmart, and Costco, to present him with a plan to get soaring food prices under control. If they don't, he's going to take other measures, including possibly a windfall tax on excess profits at the supermarkets. What is an excess profit? That's anyone's guess. It's whatever the government says it is. Both these tax plans are bound to fail. Giving a tax break to developers to build rental housing at a time when there's a massive housing shortage won't bring prices down. It will just give those developers a fatter profit margin. What do you think is likelier? That developers will drop their prices by 7%, the amount of the GST, or that they will increase their profit margins by 7%? If you think they'll drop their prices, we have some swampland in Florida we'd like to sell you. And what will happen if the government slaps a new tax on grocery stores? That's right, they'll raise their prices to cover the difference. Everywhere you look, one failed policy is being piled on top of another, and it's Canadian consumers who will have to pay for it all. The Canadian dream is dead, and we're going to have to rebuild it from scratch. In the meantime, get ready to pay much more and get much less. For an overview of the many things that are going wrong in Canada, check out our recent video on how Justin Trudeau's policies are leading Canada to economic collapse. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.